Hi, I'm Andre Picard. I don't think if anybody's introducing me, so I'll introduce myself. I'm doing the next little workshop. What I was going to do in the short time I have today is talk about advocacy, how to do it well. And short version, it's all about storytelling. So that's what I'm going to tell you. And then I'm going to pick on one or two of you to come up and do sort of a fake interview to see how you do this for real. So a little bit of theory, a little bit of practice, and lots of strategy. So hopefully send you home with something useful. As George Smitherman said, in a perfect world, no one should have to advocate. But we don't live in a perfect world, far from it. So we have to be ready for this. So I want to start with a few words about advocacy generally, a little bit of context, and then spend most of my time talking about how to tell your story, if that's what you choose to do. And that, again, is a really important point. You heard that from Steve Parrott. Not everyone has to do this. You don't have to put yourself out on public display. But if you do, you should do it well, and you should do it thoughtfully. And that's what I hope I can help you do. So the context. What is advocacy? So according to the Merriam-Webster Dictionary, it's the act or process of supporting a cause or proposal. So speaking up for something you believe in. Advocacy is essential to a democratic society. Without it, we don't have democracy. We don't have speech. We don't have lobbying, people fighting for what they want. Effective advocates can influence public policy, laws, budgets, and they do it by using facts, relationships, the media, messaging to educate government officials and elected officials about the changes they want to bring to society. So in my comments, I'm going to speak about advocacy in the broadest sense, because it can mean many, many things. But there are some things that you have in common to be an effective advocate. And I've sort of, over the years, I think a lot about this. I get approached by lots of advocates, and I've sort of boiled it down to 6 quick points that can actually fit in a tweet. So this is all you have to remember, 6 big points about how to be effective. Number 1, know the facts. To be credible, you really have to know the facts, not only on your argument, but the counter arguments of the people who will be opposing you. Then you're ready for a debate. Number 2, you have to use the facts. So any position should be grounded in factual information. Don't make stuff up. I'll leave that to the President of the United States. Number 3, probably the most important one, have a clear and concise message. In my experience, I've been doing this for 40 plus years. The number one reason people and groups fail in their advocacy is they don't really know what their message is. They have a sad story, but they don't have a message. You have to have a message that's simple and concise, almost a Twitter-sized morsel, if you will. Number 4, you have to nurture relationships. Ultimately, that's what this is about, building relationships, talking to people. Advocacy has to be a joint venture. It has to be teamwork. In your case, work with other rare diseases. You all have a lot in common. You have a lot to gain if you work together. And you'll hear this later, I think, from Durhan. You have to engage the public, or more specific, the publics, because there's many, many publics now. Our society is fragmented. You also have to speak the language of the person you're trying to influence. I always say you heard this in a really good question in the last panel, the language of politics is money. So you have to talk to them about the economics of your argument. What's the return on investment? It may seem crude, but you have to do it. It's what ultimately matters. And number 6, this one we often forget, and I think it's really crucial. You have to say thank you. Everyone is busy and their time is valuable. People get caught up in a cause, and they forget about the contributions of others. When you say thank you, it matters, and people remember it, and they'll be back. And lastly, my important point today, advocacy is just really storytelling. You want to engage others in your story, and sometimes you want to engage the media so that you have a broader reach. Just going to move this so I stay on time. So some people, though, say, I can't be bothered with the media. I don't like them. I'm comfortable. And that's fine. You don't have an obligation. But I think telling me the fact that you're sitting here, you're maybe a little predisposed to participating in this, so I'll skip over that. But the reality is some scientists, health professionals, patient representatives don't believe speaking to the media is useful, and that's fine. But why do you do it? You do it because advocacy is about communicating, and the media is a big bullhorn. It multiplies your voice. It makes it far larger. You know, if you're on, say, the CTV National News, they have about 7 million viewers a night. It takes a lot of emails to get that kind of reach. If you're in the Globe, about 1 million readers a day, etc. Now, that's why the media is important, the amplification effect. Now, things have changed a lot in the social media world. Traditionally, the way things worked when you want to advocate is, say you couldn't access a new drug treatment, your group would get together, you'd put out a press release, maybe hold a press conference, journalists would come and interview you and relay that message. Now, increasingly, you can sidestep that. If you don't like that process, you can go directly to social media. Now, social media is great, except there's a lot of competition in cyberspace. It's ephemeral, it's often illogical. Elon Musk can have 10, 20 million people following him. A rare disease group may have 100 or 200. The problem with social media is you're often speaking to the converted, so it's not the most efficient. So it is important to get out there in different ways. Now, I think if you want to be an advocate, if you want to use the media, I think it's important to understand some of the basics of how journalists operate. And I hope to do this in a practical way after. But I think a little bit of background. I do a lot of teaching at journalism schools, especially about science and health reporting. And I tell them the same thing. I say, if you're going to write about health, you need to know some of the basics. You need to know the background. You can't go in totally ignorant. And I think it works both ways. So the word journalism derives from a French word, jour, which means day. It was a way of recounting the news of the day. And the emphasis is always on the new, those first 3 words. In a 24/7 world, that word is kind of outdated. We should probably call it hourlism now, or minutalism, because the news really changes every second in this 24/7 world. Now, what's the point of this? It's to say if you want to get something out there, it has to be new and you have to be quick. It's a fast-moving world. But most important of all, I'll keep coming back to this, is having a message, a really clear message. You know, it's great to have passion, but you have to have a point. You have to have something sellable. And you have to have solutions, not just complaints. And often the complaints are not followed by the solutions. Now again, I tell my journalism students that a good story has 4 elements, or the perfect story, if you will, has 4 elements. It has a person, it has data, hopefully those are linked, that the data helps tell the story. There's a policy issue, and then there's hope. Hope is a really important element of stories, and hope should come in the form of a solution. Now, if you read the media, you know there's not a lot of perfect stories, but if you have those 4, you really have a winner, a story that's going to get attention. Now, generally, the patient is the person part of the equation in this, but without the rest, the data, the policy, and the solution, it's just a sad story that has little impact. And I often see that in the media. I see a lot of sad stories, and I see this person has gone forward, they put themselves out there in a really raw way, but what's the message? If there's no message, they're wasting their time. And how you package your message matters as well. Dr. Mike Evans, who used to run this health communications lab at the Li Ka-shing Knowledge Institute, and he produces these wonderful whiteboard videos, you can Google them. He's coined this great aphorism, which I really like. He says, stories trump data, relationship trump stories, and individuals trump organizations. And that's, I think, a really insightful comment, especially if you mull it over for a while. So what does it mean practically to an advocate? I think the best way to explain his aphorism is with a real-life example. And this is a real one that I had a couple of years ago. A public health department issued a press release warning that a number of children had been diagnosed with measles. There's a huge outbreak of measles around parts of Canada right now, including Ontario. And this public health unit urged parents to get their kids vaccinated. Now, what did journalists want to know? Well, they want to know, tell us more about these kids. How is it spreading? Where is it spreading? What's the children's relationship with the community? In other words, are they part of a religious sect where most of these outbreaks begin? Now, the data were secondary to the human stories, and they needed a credible spokesperson to answer those questions. You know, the important part of the message that everyone should get vaccinated got lost because the public health department didn't provide those really important basics. So when we write a health story, we really generally frame it with an anecdote. So why do we do, it's usually about a person. And why do we do this? So people say, oh, you're just tugging at heartstrings. But the reality is we do it because that's the way people communicate in real life. When you speak to a neighbor over the fence, you say, hey, did you hear what happened to Mary's kid? She got the measles. Can you believe that? That's how people talk about Mary and her kid. They don't talk like the public health department did in this case. So here's a quote from their terrible press release. I hope you'll think it's terrible after you hear it. There seems to be a troubling resurgence of vaccine-preventable infections that needs to be addressed, so a vigorous vaccination campaign should be undertaken. Now that's bureaucratese that no one will act on, right? You have to put it in real terms. This is going to affect you. Your kid's going to go to school and get the measles if they're not vaccinated. You have to put it in pretty blunt terms. It should also serve as a reminder, you know, you're in a very specialized, subspecialized area dealing with a rare disease. You know the jargon, but you have to avoid it with the public. It scares them off. You have to avoid the acronyms, the really big words. You have to explain things in their simplest form. If you want to advocate effectively, you have to speak like a real person, even if you're a doctor. Nobody's impressed by fancy words. They're actually turned off by them. You have to communicate as if you're talking to your neighbor over the fence. But let me come back to what Dr. Evans said, because what he said really is that individual stories are what capture the public imagination. The other stuff's important, but it's the individual story first and foremost. One of my favorite examples of this, it goes back a few years, goes back to H1N1. If you remember that was our first pandemic, the minor one. We only lost a few hundred people that time, not 60,000. But anyhow, during H1N1, there was no interest in vaccination. People were like, it's just another flu, I don't care. And all of a sudden, overnight, there was a stampede to clinics. People lined up for hours and hours to get their vaccines. And what happened? What happened was one little story. There was a boy called, I remember very clearly writing about this. His name was Evan Frustilago, 13 years old, and he died of the flu. He was a healthy young boy. We ran a big picture of him in his hockey gear, looking like a cute little kid, and he was healthy, and he died quickly. So overnight, the pandemic flu story was not about numbers anymore. It was very personal. It's about my kids are at risk. That's what makes a difference. When Evan died, the story went from being blah, 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 bunch of numbers, to holy shit, my children are at risk. I've got to do something. And that's when you really see action. You heard George talk about that. When there's momentum, when all the MPPs across parties get interested in something, things change, and they change immediately. You get to this tipping point. Again, another powerful reminder of the power of anecdote. It's also a caution, too, that you rarely control the story. You're not sure where it's going to go because the media might have different interests, something else unrelated might be happening that totally takes it out of your hands. You know, statistics are abstract, but people are real, and people are imperfect and often do strange things. When a story becomes personal or driven by fear, it can quickly spiral out of control. Context goes out the window, and it can be hard to deliver a rational message. One of the hardest things to do is communicating risk and relativity of risk, and it's something we do very poorly. You know, we do this with diseases, like, oh, how is your disease different from cancer? What's the relativity? And we don't always understand these. There's someone called Peter Sandman. He's a professor at Rutgers University in the US, and he's kind of the guru of risk communication. And this is the thing politicians, policymakers worry about the most, is some scandal or something that happens suddenly, something risky. So and Dr. Sandman has covered many things. He counsels governments around the world, and he tells them 6 key things. He says, Don't over-reassure. And you can think of your experience during COVID. Did politicians do this? For the most part, no. But this is what he says is a successful recipe. Don't over-reassure. In other words, don't downplay the potential risks. You can talk about worst-case scenarios, but also talk about most likely scenarios. And all these things I'll give you are about communicating publicly, but they do apply very specifically, I think, to the patient-clinician relationship. We don't do enough of that in medicine. Well, here's what could happen to you. Here's the worst case. You could have a gruesome death, but here's the most likely scenario. That's comforting to people. Number two, you have to acknowledge uncertainty. The three most important words in healthcare, in medicine, I think, are, I don't know. Honesty is actually reassuring to people. It's not scary. And this is a message I try to deliver. I talk to a lot of medical students, and I tell them, don't be afraid to say, I don't know. It's actually empowering. Number three, you have to treat a person or the public's fears as legitimate. Don't be dismissive. They might have the most ridiculous fear ever, but don't dismiss it. It's coming from somewhere. Even if it's coming from emotion or from a bad internet site. You have to address it, not laugh it off. You have to express your own feelings. And this goes for public health officials, policymakers, doctors. The biggest mistake that people in positions of power make is being dispassionate. Oh, my child had the flu and I was so scared. That people understand. It makes more human. You have to offer people things to do to protect themselves. What fuels fear and anger is powerlessness. So you have to give people practical advice, actionable advice. And again, no one knows this better than patients, especially with rare disorders. Power comes from knowledge. And the final point he makes is always one that I make, that don't worry about panic, because panic is actually rare. One of the great ironies, I've covered many public, huge disasters, hurricanes, plane crashes, etc. And there's very little panic. In fact, what's eerie about these big tragedies is how quiet they are. That's the scary part. The only thing that makes people panic is actually telling them not to panic. Very interesting part of human nature. So again, these are tips about crisis communication, but they all apply to advocacy, and they all apply in many ways to the patient-physician relationship. Now, I promised you to, I'm almost done with this because I want to get down to torturing you in person. I promised to talk a little bit about the journalistic, how does it work? And sometimes I hesitate to do this. I got, the sausage making. Sometimes it's best to not know how the sausage is made because it gets a little less tasty. But I want to give you a very quick overview of sort of the sausage making in my business. So what really matters these days, unfortunately, is hits on the web. That means the quantity of stories matters more than the quality. It means there's a penchant for clickbait, for really catchy headlines that don't necessarily affect or reflect the story, and so on. So that's the bad part of our business. There's a lot of derivative regurgitation instead of original reporting. If something big happens, and all these websites essentially just steal the reporting and put it out there. It costs them nothing, and they make money from the ads. So we've seen this massive explosion of media outlets, but we actually have less variety of news and less original reporting. So it's a bit sad. Makes it difficult for groups like yourself to break through too, because there are fewer voices. People are quite critical of the news media, and a lot of the criticism is justified, and I'll say that as someone who in the business. The range of quality ranges from superb to disgraceful. I think in the health field, actually, we have the best reporting ever. There's some really specialized outlets now, and we have the worst dross that's ever been published going out there every day. So there's the extremes are getting worse or better. Costs a lot of money to produce quality journalism, to train people, to give them time to do research and verification, to package the information in a way that's appealing. And nobody wants to pay for news. So there's a dilemma there. Costs a lot, we don't want to pay for it. So what do? We do the cheap stuff, the catchy headlines, the regurgitation. Now, the short version of this, I think you have to remember, is you get what you pay for. And sadly, we live in a world where people have this fantasy that collecting and distributing information is free. And it's not, for better or worse. There's a lot of paywalled publications, and they tend to be the best ones, unfortunately. A lot of the so-called media world now is listicles and cat videos, and not important coverage and analysis of important social issues and things that really affect people. Now, I'm telling you all this so you'll recognize that the environment in which you're operating and I'm operating is changing very rapidly, and it's not always easy. So you can look at this in two ways. It's going to make your job of communicating the health information you want to get out there more difficult, because you have to do more of the heavy lifting. Or if you're a glass half full person, you can say, this is an opportunity to tell your story better and differently and better. And especially if you do the other things I talked about, like have good relationships, know who to approach, pick the right media to work with. The reality is that communication has become more important than ever. It's an exciting time to be an advocate, but it's also a challenging time. So I'm going to end by the same way I began, because we know that in communication, the single most important thing is repetition. Repetition does work. People remember things if they hear them over and over, even if they're nonsense, they actually remember them, sadly. But, so I will end by repeating. There's no one way of promoting your cause, your research, or advocating, or fighting for social justice. But if you have an important message to deliver, a compelling story to tell, you have to find a way to do it that suits you best. So I'm going to stop there. I don't know if you want to ask a couple of questions on general advocacy. We can do that right now. And then I'm going to ask for a volunteer to come up and tell their story. So I'm going to sit here and be a journalist and ask you to just answer some questions as I was do in a story. So any quick general questions before we do that? Yep. Oh, I got the first question from expert. I'm very, very careful.
Oh, no. You're the expert. I guess for patients, what is the best way to pitch this to, in terms of our stories, to media and to larger media? Because oftentimes when we do that, they get overlooked, or it's not necessarily the more important thing to be talking or like to be, written about in terms of like opinion pieces, etc. So what is the best way to get our stories out there if we are writers and want to be able to tell our stories?
Yeah, so I'll start by saying it's really difficult because there's a constant flow of stuff, people pitching you on stuff. I think the single most effective way, for better or worse, is to build on something that's already in the media. Once, use an example, the one that just pops into my head. So Stephen Harper one day was Prime Minister. Stephen Harper went to the emergency room, he had an asthma attack. Well, all of a sudden, we were interested in asthma, right? It was on the front page. This Prime Minister is affected. Let's talk more about that. That's a really good example. As George said, if you have someone in a position of power who has an interest or has a condition, that immediately gives you an in. There's a great episode of West Wing. I don't know if you remember that really great show where one of the members, or one of the elected members, had a grandson with Down syndrome. And he blocked the entire budget for a week because he wanted like $1 million out of a $5 trillion budget. He wanted $1 million to go to Downs. And it being a bureaucracy, nobody could figure out why. And finally, somebody asked him. He went to the president. The president said, what do you want? I want $1 million for my grandson to get for better research. It's done. I'll give you $50 million, if you vote. That's an example, kind of a cynical one, but if you feed off the news, but it's hard for rare diseases. But the good thing you have on your side is there's a lot of scientific breakthroughs. Remember I said, what's new? News? It's NEW, it's the new drugs. We had the one George referred to last week. He didn't like the story, but it was still, here's a new treatment for Alzheimer's. That's gonna get a lot of attention. And that's how we tend to write about rare disorders, is when there's new treatments. Genomics is exploding, so there's ways of doing it. But I don't pretend, that it's not really, really tough. There's 1,000 things a day. I probably get 100 pitches a day just myself, and I'll pass on 2 or 3 to my boss. I'll do 1 a month. So, yeah, it's tough. Any other general questions, comments? Okay, now who's a patient who wants to talk about, come up here and see, you want to give it a try? Okay. I think you know your story. We'll see. So let's give her the mic and I'll sit down. Yeah, come and have a seat and yeah. So, you know, my boss has told me that some politician has this thing I've never heard of, something. So I've come out here and I understand you're with a patient group. So I want to ask you a little bit so we can write a story about this. So can you tell me a little bit about your condition? What does this mean? Okay.
The condition is amyloidosis. And there's lots of different variations of amyloidosis. The particular one I have is the hereditary form, and unfortunately affects, I have cardiac involvement, neuropathy involvement, and gastro involvement.
So neuropathy is what? That's your nerves?
That's your nerves. Yeah.
Okay.
You get the small fibre and the large fibre.
So your tingly fingers and stuff?
Oh yeah, numbness, pain, tingling,
okay.
yeah.
Great. And what kind, you said there's different kinds of this. What kind do you have? You have a genetic kind?
It's a genetic kind, that's
Okay.
correct.
So how did you find out about this?
It was probably the best part of 6-7 years going to different specialists. Things kind of kicked off. One of the things when I think back now was the tingling in the fingertips and the toes. But I thought that was just due to excessive keyboarding. So I kind of dismissed that. It's just, that one of those things. And then what happened after that, shortly after that, Andre, was I started losing weight. And at first I thought this was great because I'd put on quite a bit of weight when I stopped smoking many moons ago. So to lose weight without actually going on any kind of diet and I just assumed it was okay initially. But it started getting quite dramatic. And I went obviously to my GP and explained to her what was going on. And I was told initially that it was mainly a virus. And it was something that she had had and lots of patients have been complaining about it. So you carry on down this. And then one day I felt really, really low. I was going to the library that day to go and borrow some books, as you did back then. And it was only a few steps up to the library, but it took me half an hour to recover from those few steps. Just really strange. So I called my GP and made an appointment with her. And she she looked at an ECG, and we kind of went down that path. But there was nothing unusual. Mm. And the same with the weight loss, there was nothing unusual that came back. The neuropathy I hadn't really delved into because, as I say, through my own admission, I assumed that was just excessive keyboarding and things like that.
And isn't there a test for this? Can't you just test and know if you have it or not?
What, for amyloidosis?
Yeah.
No.
Okay.
It's a weird and wonderful thing. And each person has a different way of how it starts. They have different symptoms, and it follows different ways and methods, unfortunately. And if we look at the big picture, which was something I didn't look at initially, was you've got over 8,000-9,000 different rare diseases out there. So how can we expect our GPs to be able to single one and know that that's what it is? Yeah. So they've got a very, very difficult job. And amyloidosis mimics a lot of other diseases. So we look at the more common ones, that's what we would look at, which is fine, it's the way the world works. And we roll those out. So because of that, it took such a long time to get to the end of it. One of the turning points, and I'd also been sent for a stress test. It was a radioactive test. and everything looked great. The stress test, I told the doctor, I can't do this. I was absolutely pooped after probably a minute or so.
Okay.
And then the one day I took it back for some blood work. And in the blood work, Andre, I went to the doctor, she checked my blood pressure, and it was something like 70 or 65 over 35. She called an
Not so good.
ambulance, and that was the start of the cardiac diagnosis.
Okay.
We realised there was something going on, but we're still confused. I was treated for high blood pressure. Go figure.
Yeah.
High blood pressure? I don't think so.
So let me interrupt you there.
Sure.
So what I'm doing here is I'm being sort of a journalist who's thrown into something. They know nothing about it. They're going to ask very basic questions. They're going to look for a human interest story. And it's going to be fairly superficial. But so what would I do with that as that journalist? I would probably zero in on that. One day she was walking up the library stairs, couldn't make it, had been previously healthy, went to her doctor, and this odyssey began. Now, the more ideal, and then, get into the politician, et cetera, it'd be a quickie hit story. A better scenario is if you're dealing with someone who has more expertise in the area. So that's, I'll try and do something more specific now. So in this case, I'm a journalist who does very specific things. I only write about health policy and medicine, been at it for a long time. So I would do a lot of research before doing the interview, as opposed to the general journalist. So I would go in with a very specific question. And again, I tell my journalism students, you should know the answer to the questions you ask before you get them. And what you want in a story, I talked about this mixture of data and anecdote. What you want out of an interview is some good quotes. You want opinion, you want emotion, and you want anecdote. The facts, you already know them, but the facts are boring. So what I want to do is take the facts that I have, and I want to wrap them around a person. So if I went in as a more specialized journalist, the interview would be very different. I would say, so I'm working on this piece about how people with rare disorders have a really awful diagnostic odyssey. It takes a long time to get diagnosed, and how can we change that? So I wondered, can you tell me a little bit? I understand it took you 6-7 years to get a proper diagnosis. What's the most frustrating part of that odyssey for you?
For me, the most frustrating was not knowing what I was dealing with. And we couldn't really treat it because we didn't know what that little animal was. So you've got all these things going on. You were given medication for some of them, but they're like a Band-Aid.
They were for treating symptoms.
Yeah, they were treating symptoms. We didn't really know what we were dealing with.
And getting a diagnosis, why does that matter?
Well, it matters for a number of reasons, Andre, because if you've got a diagnosis and there's medication available for that diagnosis, you can then be treated. But if you don't have a diagnosis, well, we're just in the dark. We're just fumbling, and we're not making that patient's life any better.
And what was your feeling the day you heard your diagnosis? Was it liberating? What did it do for you?
When I was diagnosed, the first thing I did was I went back home, looked up amyloidosis, because I did ask the cardiologist, so now what? He said to me, this was 2015, Andre, he said, palliative care. And 10 years ago, palliative care really meant you're going home to die,
Yep.
right? That was the message. So I felt quite sick inside, but I wanted to know, what is this amyloidosis? And of course, the news, as I went to Dr. Google, was really no different because it had all these doom and gloom stories. So it wasn't, I was glad I had a diagnosis, but I wasn't happy that it was that diagnosis.
And you're a spokesperson now. People don't go home to die anymore.
Pretty much, yep, because as we all know, early diagnosis is a key to a good prognosis.
So there's an example, I think, where I think the interview is richer, gets more detail. One thing I would say, a really important tip is often when somebody asks a question, this is especially important on video, radio, repeat the question. So when I ask you, was this freedom? You say, was this liberation? I felt liberated by this diagnosis. They're sort of throwing you a line here that they want to quote back. So there's ways, but if you disagree with it, don't repeat it. In fact, say, no, you're wrong. But little things like that matter. Anybody else I want to give someone else a chance. Anyone out there who's just started on treatment? If I was doing an interview about drugs, anybody want to give that a try? I'm not going to write it in the paper, so don't worry. Not without your permission. And we should applaud for Anne-Marie for being brave and coming up with it. Anyone else want to give it a quick try? I know I'm standing between you and lunch, but lunch will be soon. Here's another brave soul. So what's your treatment? Which one of these is your? Any of those?
Tafamidis.
Okay.
Yep.
Hi, so thanks. So I'm a journalist at the Globe and Mail, and my boss has asked me to write about this really promising drugs called tafamidis. I understand you're taking it. Can you tell me a little bit of your condition? Why are you taking this?
Certainly, Andre. I have a condition called amyloidosis. I have a protein in my body that goes rogue, and it forms fibers that deposit in my heart. And I'm going to die when my heart becomes a piece of old leather like your shoe, and it's going to stop beating. Now, this tafamidis stabilizes that molecule and stops it from going into fibers. But the exciting thing right now is we have 2 new drugs which are coming to market. I want to tell you that Canada is the worst country in the developed world in approving new drugs. We take the longest.
Okay. So before we talk about how long they take, tell me what these drugs do. Do they keep your heart from being leather?
What they do is it's not a cure. It only treats the condition. So the tafamidis stops the protein, or slows the protein from going into the fibers, which then get deposited in my heart. But the fibers that are already in my heart are going to stay there.
But they're going to be a little less damaging.
No, they're just going to be less being deposited.
Okay. So which one of these, you're taking one of these drugs, but you want to take the other 2 also?
Well, I can't right now because it's not approved in Canada. It's approved in the United States, European Union, United Kingdom, some cases Brazil, some cases Japan, but pity, not in Canada.
And we know Canada is the worst in the OECD, 735 days on average for approval of a new drug.
Exactly. It takes the longest, as you say, 735 days.
But a few more days or months here and there, is that going to make a difference to you?
Well, certainly. Certainly for this disease, it affects an older population, and time is of the essence.
And we know, Canada has a complicated drug approval process. Even if these drugs get approved, do you think they'll get funded?
Now that's a great question because they're very expensive. I would like to tell you I come from British Columbia, and the British Columbia government puts out on a site called Expensive Drugs for Rare Diseases. Mm-hmm. My drug, tafamidis, which goes by the genetic name Vindamax.
Generic name.
Generic name. As tafamidis, the other name is Vindamax, cost $195,000 a year. That's expensive. Now,
not compared to some other drugs.
You're correct. But the wonderful thing is if we can have some competition in the marketplace with these other 2 new drugs coming, perhaps there's an opportunity, and my apologies to the pharmaceutical representatives in the audience.
I'll never apologize to them.
That maybe we can reduce that cost. But I also want to make the point that this is only training wheels right now, because all these 3 drugs only slow the progression of the disease. Within 3 years, my personal belief is we're going to have drugs that are curative. They're going to take those fibers out of our hearts. But if we have to wait another, as you say, 735 days for them to be approved, I'm not going to be alive.
Not a pretty grim prognosis. And do you think, how do you make the case that it's worth spending $195,000 a year to extend your life a bit?
Well, that's a good case. We have to figure out our values. Now, I hope you don't mind. You might have just felt the ground shake underneath your feet. That was my grandparents rolling over in the graves. They would have called Tommy Douglas by his first name because they were instrumental in bringing social medicine to Canada. back in the 1900s. We have to take a look at our fundamental values. Do we value healthcare? Do we value life? Do we value quality of life? An excellent question.
But we also have to value return on investment. We have a lot of things we can spend money on. We have to get value for that money.
So it's a hard, and I think we have to go to the debate. Some people will say that there is no answer to that. How do I justify my $195,000 when it would build a tunnel underneath the 401 that people are going to use daily? It's a hard question.
And we're almost out of time in our radio interview. Last thing I want to ask you, the future of medicine is personalized medicine. Is this an example of what you're happening, you taking this drug, just the early stages of personalized medicine?
Certainly, because with the choices, you can have a conversation with your medical care team. As your previous interview, Anne-Marie here, was saying, it tends to be individual. All of us have different symptoms, and so perhaps one of these drugs works better for me. It's real-world experience. It might not work as well for somebody else. So having choice is a way of the future, personal medicine.
Wonderful. Thanks for your time. And there's
Thank
an
you very
example
much.
of a wonderful interview. Perfect.
Thank you for the chance. I'm actually trying this. I'm trying to read things like
Well, that's a very good first try. You're doing very well. And he had all the elements. He had a personal story, he had anecdote, brought it back to Medicare, made a good quip about what politicians are wasting money on without lingering on it. Perfect, very good interview. You should be on with my friend Matt Galloway sometime. It'd be great. Now, time for lunch. I'm getting the... So thank you for being there. If you have other questions, I'll be at lunch. Thanks. It's fun.